For my presentation, I did how views on people negatively affect psychology. The views I'm going to be covering are stereotypes, both good and bad, implicit bias, prejudice, discrimination, racism, and privileges, both good and bad. How positive views negatively affect psychology. You can have an over positive reaction towards clients and like a um, be overly nice, and uh, negative aspects can be ignored. So with that over positivity, you can overlook things that are on the negative side, and it creates like a disconnect from reality. So it holds these people to like a higher standard than in reality. How negative views negatively affect psychology. You have like a predetermined idea or feeling of how this person is, how you treat this person. It interferes with the psychological work itself. If you have background of how you feel about them already, it'll affect how you work with them, and it could potentially lead to worse problems. So if you try to go to someone for help and they give you the wrong help, or they could create worse problems. What is a good stereotype? A good stereotype is a positive generalization made about people based on a group they belong to. An example of this would be all Asians are good and smart at math. A bad stereotype is similar, but the opposite. An example of this would be all Muslim people are terrorists and violent. Stereotypes are negative because they can cause people to believe oversimplified ideas, which aren't true. It relies on a false assumption made about a group of people, and it groups all people together as the same, which also isn't true. Implicit bias is a bias someone has depending on someone's background. So it's usually like a positive thing, like a positive bias you have towards someone. So a teacher expects white students to perform better than Hispanic students, would be an example. Implicit bias is negative because it gives unintentional benefits to people that are being biased towards. And on the other side of that, it gives a disadvantage to those who are being biased against. So in this example, an implicit bias would be put towards the white students, and the opposite could be said for the Hispanic students. Privileges. Privileges are unearned advantages or gifts associated with belonging to a majority group. An example of this would be white people feel safer when interacting with law enforcement. The other side of privileges. So if there's a good side, there has to be a bad side. So this is an unearned disadvantage associated with belonging to a minority group. An example of this would be while white people feel safe, people of other races or minority races feel fear when interacting with law enforcement. Privileges are negative because they give an unfair advantage to a majoritized group. In turn, they give another unfair advantage to those who don't belong in the same group, similar to the implicit bias. They're based solely upon characteristics and not who the person is themselves. Prejudice is an emotional act towards people based on their group they belong to. It's the belief of a stereotype. Again, could be positive or negative, usually negative. An example of this would be all black people are poor and unable to support anyone financially. Prejudice is negative because it, again, assumes all people of a group are the same and gives unfair judgment to those individuals. Discrimination is a negative act or behavior directed toward people based on their background. An example of this would be an underqualified white person receives a job over an overqualified black person simply because he's white. Discrimination is negative because of unfair treatment and inequality. Can lose hope in equal society because of things like this. And this can cause mental or emotional harm, because if you are overqualified for something and looked over just because of what group you belong to or what race you belong to, that causes problems. Prejudice versus discrimination. Prejudice is a thought or an attitude. Discrimination is a physical act. Prejudice is internal, meaning like your thoughts. Discrimination is external, something that actually happens. Prejudice can be similar to implicit bias. Discrimination is on purpose. So while prejudice can be something you do involuntary, discrimination happens on purpose. Racism is the belief that one race is above or below another. Basically a negative outlook on someone's race. An example of this would be the KKK, because they were severely racist towards people of color. Racism is negative because there's an all-around lack of equality. It's very harmful to both emotionally and psychologically, and it separates society and the world. Racism versus prejudice and discrimination. Racism is limited to a race. Prejudice and discrimination can be based on any characteristic. And racism is a form of prejudice and discrimination associated with race. In conclusion, while positive views on people are nice to have, they only complicate things in terms of psychology. Negative views aren't a great thing to have, and they're also bad for psychology. In psychology, you need to be a blank slate or an open book. And these are my references.